I'm Alan Boyle, president of CAISW again. And if you were with us for the banquet last night, you know all about Ben Patrusky, our executive director emeritus. And we're so happy to have our inaugural Patrusky Lecture in Ben's honor. For decades, Ben has served as executive director and as program director for New Horizons in Science. And he's taken pride in bringing scientists to science writers, scientists who can tell you about the surprising things that are to come, or to put an entire field in perspective. And so the Patrusky Lecture is aimed at embodying the spirit of Ben's creativity and his masterful role as the impresario for New Horizons for so long. And we've got a great speaker as the inaugural Patrusky Lecturer. And Ben is here to tell you all about the lecture and what the speaker can bring to the table. And so, without further ado, Ben Patrusky.
Well, I promised George I'd keep it short. As you heard me say last night, it was an amazing honor that CAISW has bestowed on me. I was quite overwhelmed when I first learned about this lectureship was being established in my name. Doubly and triply so when Roz Reed, our esteemed program maestro, informed me that George M. Whitesides had accepted her invitation to make the inaugural presentation. I had the great good fortune of making the acquaintance of the remarkable Dr. Whitesides some years ago, and given the nature and purpose of New Horizons, I could not imagine or have hoped for a more considered, more thrilling choice for this, the first Patrusky Lecture. For in addition to being a frontline researcher and inventor of breathtaking range and surpassing accomplishment, Dr. Whitesides is also a brilliant expositor of science who has throughout his spectacular career been dedicated to and actively engaged in efforts to enhance and advance public understanding of science. As such, he has shown himself to be a most generous friend and mentor to many members of our community, the science writing community, and you can count me among them, particularly during my time as New Horizons program director. I long ago lost count of the number of times that I checked in with Dr. Whitesides for tips about subjects and speakers, and not just from his field of chemistry, but from all areas of science, given his vast spectrum of knowledge. Never did he fail to respond. Never did he fail to provide an abundance of invaluable leads, guidance, and insight. I remain eternally indebted to him, all the more so now that he has agreed to link his august name to mine. You do me great honor, George M. Whitesides, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and privilege to present George M. Whitesides.
I've known Ben for decades, not centuries, but decades. And I was particularly happy to come, but even happier to find that he's really adopting his role as Prince really well. When I first knew him, he was scruffy. He and I were both scruffy. I was an assistant professor at MIT, and he was whatever he was at that point. And we wore clothes which were decaying, and we didn't really smell very good, and we were, doing enthusiastic things. And just look at what's happened to him now. I was thinking about wearing a suit, but I decided that the contrast, those of us who are just princelings should dress below the prince. But I'm very grateful to Ben, and also very grateful to this community for a number of things. One is, I believe, as you all believe, that the communication of science and technology to the broader public is really, really important for the running of a democratic society. We all believe that. But there's another feature which I've come to believe, and it came in significant part out of Ben trying to correct my wrong thinking. And I'm going to start by talking about this a little more. But I think that actually science writing has maybe now more to teach science than science has to teach science writing. Because in the same sense that you all do something that I deeply disapprove of, which is to mistake news in the sense of a breaking event for what the public really needs to know, we do something which is equally bad, which is we get up in the morning and we do experiments without ever asking, why are we doing it? And you all are wonderful storytellers. And if we could learn, we scientists could learn from you how to tell stories, it would not only help you, it would help us. And it's something which I hope we as the scientific community learns how to work with you who do it professionally. I know that I talk to my students and I ask them, what's the story? They don't even know what a story is. The basic concept of a story is not familiar. They get all tangled up in the details, but it's very hard to teach people about stories if they've never really experienced the idea of writing a story. So we have an enormous amount to learn from you if we can find some way of communicating better. So let me show you, to begin with, one of the many points in which, in fact, Ben and I have argued over time. And there'll be others as we go along, but it's this basic issue, and that is, what's news? And I've always thought that news or science reporting was about explaining to the public what science and technology meant. And Ben has explained to me patiently that it has nothing to do with that. Actually, he's been pretty impatient in general terms. But Ben is a first derivative guy. I mean, he looks at curves like that, and I'm enough of a physicist to believe that if you leave the scales off your graphs, they have broader impact. So there is a vertical there, but whatever it is, So if whatever it is changed rapidly, that's news, regardless of whether it makes any difference or not. But the things that actually, I think, make a difference, like some subjects I'm going to talk about, the quality of health care in the United States. Are we spending money correctly in dealing with medicine? What do we actually do in sustainability? Do solar cells make any possible difference to anyone over the course of time? I could go on with a list of these sorts of things in which one reads about the wonders of science, but it's not at all clear that it has anything to do with the impact of science on society. So it's a really, really interesting question. And I think that in brief conversations with Ben, that as he's gotten older, he's beginning to approach the level of wisdom that I hoped for him when he was in his early 30s, early 20s. And if he keeps going for another 50 years, who knows what good things might come up. Asymptotic, but the question is, to 0, plus or minus? So the subject that I'm going to talk about is the one that's here, which is simplicity and science, simplicity, surprise, and science. But there's a sub-theme, which is how do you go from nothing to reality? And what do I mean by that? The US right now is in a state of really substantial change. We've gone from an economy which dominated the world to one which is one of several, with different flavors. And why did we dominate the world? We have the notion that we did so because we were uniquely smart. Actually, probably no. We might have been smart, but it really helped that the economy in Europe was destroyed in the years following World War II, and Japan had been largely flattened. So there wasn't much competition. Now there's competition from a range of different places, parts of the world, with different styles, different flavors of capitalism. And we would like to do something, or I would like to do something, which I would like to phrase to you in the following sense. That is, what should we in science be doing now to provide good jobs and a livable world for my grandchildren? And I put in the grandchildren for two reasons. One of them is my grandchildren. I have grandchildren. And they'll be on the job market in about 25 years. So we're looking at a 25-year time span, which is actually completely and totally incompatible with the Goldman Sachs time scale. And the second thing is that my son, George, are you here? See? Oh, he's actually here. I was going to say bad things about you. But anyway, he is the reason why I'm thinking about grandchildren, because they're his children. So they're very cute, and they're about that tall, and they're going to have to be employed at some point doing something that's really interesting. So the question is, how should we deal with this? The US has been phenomenally good at going from ideas, that is, from nothing, to reality, meaning jobs, goods, and services that benefit society in a pretty efficient way. But other people are learning how to do it. And we're actually forgetting how to do it. So what do? This, incidentally, is a slow change. And it, incidentally, is something that you all are uniquely qualified to help the country explain and understand, because we don't understand it right now. So let me give you a little Rorschach test to begin with. Here are three pictures. This is a widget of some kind, a relatively small widget, a stainless steel octopus. This is a really big widget, and this is a really big molecule. Now, what do they have in common? And I would argue there are two commonalities. One is they're very big, they're very fast, they're very complicated, and they're very, very expensive. So that's one commonality. And the second is that it's very hard to answer the question, who cares? Now, this is what we do. This is the sociology of science worldwide. And is it the right one? So what I really want to do today is to discuss this question with you with three components, one of which is familiar, two of which may be a little bit less familiar to this group. One is, what is science, and how do you think about making this process from something that's a fundamentally new idea to something that makes a difference? The second is some public policy issues that come along with this. And the third is a reflection on the sociology of science, because the three are all interlocked in this discussion. So we start with a question, which is one that all of you are familiar with, which is, why do we scientists do what we do? Why does anybody do what they do? There's a kind of notion that science and professions like journalism have a deep altruistic streak in them, and perhaps they do, but there are also a lot of things that are involved that have to do with getting ahead and the pressures of paying the bills and just doing stuff like this. So the motivations range all the way from trying to save the world to how do I get a slightly bigger office at the corner than anyone else does. And all of these play into this question of what one does. Now, there's a little bit of history that's worthwhile thinking about in this, because particularly for those of you, the flood of you who fortunately are entering the profession, all of this was sort of set in stone before you were actually born. And before World War II, the engine which has run the American creative scientific process, that is the research university, did not exist. Research university was an invention of World War II. And it came because there was the idea that we won World War II through a combination of Yankee grit and Yankee technology. The Spitfire engine, high-octane gasoline, better this and that, this won the war. If you talk to the Russians, they note that the war was over from their perspective before the US invasion of Normandy, but this is a historical sidelight. The fact is that at the end of the war, among other people, Vannevar Bush put together an extraordinarily influential report, which those of you who have not read it should. It's short, so you can read it. Endless Frontier. And the Endless Frontier said, in a lot of words, that the United States needs the capability of the great industrial laboratories like IBM and GE in the university to provide a technological foundation for its future activities. And what's interesting about this report is if you read it, it was very utilitarian in its objective. That is, the U.S. needed this foundation for three reasons. One was national security, one was creation of jobs, and one was provision of health. At no point did following your curiosity come into this. It just wasn't part of it. So out of this has come a sociological notion, which I would argue has a very strong root in the great success of physics in this period, and I return to this in a bit, which said that the universities, research universities, are important. Part of what they do should be predominantly, in fact, the pursuit of fundamental curiosity-driven research, whatever that means, and that applied research is secondary in importance and secondary in intellectual value. I will submit to you that this argument is fundamentally wrong. We'll continue. There's a third subject which is probably interesting to some of you, which I won't talk about, which is that we have reached the conclusion that the best way of preserving the creativity and purity of the scientific system is through the notion of peer review. The difficulty with this is, there are many difficulties, but one of the difficulties is that the peer review system was never intended to be peer in the sense of jury of your peers. It was intended to be the smartest people around. There are too few smart people, too many proposals to be refereed. So it's become something which is basically a democratic process, and there's probably no human activity that's less democratic than creation of good new ideas. So we're fundamentally screwed up in that. That's a technical thing, but very important for the sociology of science. So how does one think about this problem? And probably there are 3 or 4 ways, but I want to bring up one here, which is deeply rooted in a subject which one almost never hears about in universities, which is ethics. And the issue here is the following. I am paid to do research by the federal government. Do I have an obligation as a consequence of that? Or is this manna from heaven? And I think the easiest way of disentangling that kind of problem is simply to follow the money. And one starts in scientific research, particularly as done in universities, with taxpayers who can be corporations or individuals, who very, very reluctantly give money to the government. And they do that not out of a sense of saving society, but rather because they go to jail if they don't. And then a fraction of that is paid, a tiny fraction of that is given to universities, and the taxpayers put up with it on the theory that research ultimately makes the world a better place. The trouble is that universities have no capability in general of providing a finished, packaged good, a benefit, so that ultimately the knowledge and the people here go to corporations. And corporations may or may not be imaginative. Right now they're largely not. But what they have is the muscle to actually make something in acceptable form, and that is what is seen as a benefit, the products of corporations. So this cyclic process goes from taxpayers to benefit. I'm sorry, something here has happened. Here we are. So the question is, if I do research in a university, do I have an ethical obligation to the taxpayers who make it possible for me to do so? And almost everyone would say yes, but there would be big differences in how you do this. And one argument says that you try to solve problems, and the other argument says you follow your curiosity, and that provides the knowledge that's necessary ultimately to solve problems. This argument is embedded in something which I suspect many of you know as Pasteur's quadrant. And if you don't know about Pasteur's quadrant, you should go and read the book by Don Stokes, which describes this, because this is a centerpiece of what will, in my view, change or frame the discussion between society and longer-term research over the next several decades. It's really, really an important argument. And it's phrased in these terms. Along here, there is a axis. It's a 2-by-2 plot. Why is it a 2-by-2 plot? And I've argued that it's a 2x2 plot because it basically comes out of the world of Mackenzie and Bain, and 2x2 is comprehensible and 3x3 is basically not. So we have 2x2, and this axis is understanding, and this axis is utility. And so the argument is that there are activities which are, I wish I wouldn't do that. There are activities which are pure basic research, whatever that means, and certainly Bohr, whose name is given to this quadrant, was not looking to solve a problem. He was just interested in describing the nature of the atom. Then there's an axis which is pure utility, purely empirical, which is given the name Edison. And it is true that Mr. Edison took anything that he could make a filament of and strung it between two posts, electrically conducting posts with a potential, to see which one gave off the most light. And we're familiar with most of these, and we have tended in the US more and more to say that universities do this, industry does this, and then there's a transfer from here to here. The argument is, what about Pasteur? And Pasteur, you will know from pasteurization, which is heating milk so it doesn't spoil. But Pasteur was a much more interesting person than that. He was also one of the pioneers of vaccination, and he is often called the father of microbiology because he connected disease and spoilage with little things called bacteria, which we didn't know about at that point. So what Pasteur did was something which was quite novel and remains really important. That is, he took a big problem, a utilitarian problem, which is public health and spoilage, for which there was no scientific solution. And in order to solve that problem, he invented microbiology and applied immunology. And that kind of activity, that is starting with a problem that's basically an insoluble problem, and inventing, using that as a pull to invent the science that solves that problem, is a style, and one which I will argue with you for most work that goes on in universities is actually a better way of doing it than following your curiosity. There are lots of reasons for saying that, but I'm going to assert that as a notion. Now, my friends in Harvard, who are often very good basic scientists, they get very annoyed with me because they say, you've sold out to the forces of darkness. No. I mean, my view is that they're substantially, in general, less creative than they might think, and all of us who are just normal human beings actually are better off working on good problems, and the good problems often come from applications. So how do we deal with problems in reduction in healthcare cost? How do we make a sustainable world? How do we think about energy? Those are all practical problems, but we don't have the science to solve them. So they're very, very interesting from that perspective. Now here's the question that always comes up. What about quantum mechanics? Because quantum mechanics absolutely was a product of pure curiosity. I mean, physics was considered in 1900 to be a dead field. Every problem was solved by the fact that Newton had shown that balls fall down, and Maxwell's equations had taken care of everything else. What more could you possibly ask? You knew electromagnetism, you knew gravity, and that's it. And there was this sort of niggling little thing that if you took a slit and sunlight and a prism, and you shone a beam of light from the sun onto the wall, you got a continuous spectrum, which we all understood from various things, but it had these funny black lines in it. And we couldn't explain the funny black lines. And because you couldn't find that, and because people were curious, we found that everything that was known that made physics dead was correct, but it was incomplete. And there was a whole substratum of understanding called quantum mechanics, which came from that discovery. Absolutely, absolutely true. And anyone here who would like to come up afterwards and tell me that they are prepared to invent quantum mechanics, the next version of that, I would be happy to write the check myself, because it was, among other things, quite cheap to do this. But that isn't the way the world works. And the problem with the idea that one should think about science as an art form, which is done purely for aesthetics, runs into a resource allocation problem, which is that I can't make an argument that science as an art form is intrinsically better than ballet or orchestra or whatever else you want to say as an art form. So if you say this is one of many art forms, then unfortunately it will probably be supported as an art form. But the amount of money that goes into the National Endowment for the Humanities doesn't begin to pay the postage for the National Science Foundation for a week. So it's just, this kind of argument won't work. You have to think about it in a different way. So the argument that I want to make to you is that among the many ways of thinking about this problem, one of them is going to center around a topic that Gene Stanley just discussed, which is complexity and controlling it. And another is a topic that's oddly enough much less well understood, which is simplicity in science. I showed you at the beginning these big complicated machines and big complicated molecules. One thing about making big complicated things is it's a lot harder to make little simple things, oddly enough. Big complicated things are usually big engineering tasks. Little simple things are more complicated. So let me start this by asking about the words. What is simplicity? You think about simplicity and complexity as being antonyms. It's not clear that they are, and in fact, I think they're probably not. But in any event, there is a test put together, or at least I first heard it, from the Reverend John Polkinghorne, who's a theologian. And it has to do with what's called in the trade, the theological trade, the tea kettle question. And the tea kettle question is the following. I look at the tea kettle, and the water's hot, and I say, why is the water hot? Question that's equivalent of what is simplicity. And there are a lot of answers to that. There's an answer that says the kinetic energy of the molecules is high, and they bounce around, and if they're high enough, some of them bounce out, and that's called heat, and that's a scientific answer. And there's an answer that says it was sitting on the stove for 20 minutes, and that's a historical answer. And there's an answer that says, because I wanted to have tea, and that's an intentional answer. And according to the Reverend, there's an answer of the class of it's part of God's greater plan for the universe. I happen not to have personally a religious corpuscle in my body, but that is a legitimate question. And his point is that if you have a set of words like what is simplicity or why is the water hot, which are actually the same words asking multiple fundamentally different questions, and you provide only one box for an answer, you're doomed. You have to define what you're really talking about. So I'm going to talk about simplicity from one point of view. Let me give you a little background. Complexity is a subject that's been discussed in physics primarily for some decades. I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment. And it's a pretty highly developed science. Arguably, it's stalled at the moment, but that's a question of taste. Academics love complexity, and they love emergence, which is a word that says if things get to be complicated enough, funny stuff starts happening. And maybe that's because we don't understand it, but maybe that's because there's something new there. I mean, all that's absolutely correct. The real world really doesn't like complexity. You don't like your airplane to decide that even though it's a gigantic collection of parts flying in more or less unison, you don't like some of them to develop a mind of their own and go off and do something else with, the wing parting company or something of that kind. So what the world wants is really simplicity. You want the world to work. And so there's a fundamental tension between the interest in complexity intellectually and the desire for simplicity functionally. What is an example of complexity? Here's one. Complex systems often have the characteristic that they have components, and the components can be automobiles or drivers. The system is traffic, and if you ask how this works, actually we don't understand very well what happens when things cease to work. There are funny things that go on when you have interacting systems. Here's another example. All of you know what that is. That's a Bill Gates. Here's something else. Those of you who are younger, that is, increasingly under 50, but younger, that's Bono. And then the question is, if you know all the characteristics that you can about Bill Gates and about Bono, can you predict what comes out of that? And the answer is no, you can't. That's a complex system. There are others, and this is perhaps the one that is scientifically most interesting. That eye chart, which semi-intentionally is designed not to be read, is a collection of all, no, a tiny subset of the molecules present in a cell, and then connected to one another by some of the major transformations. All these transformations go through valves called enzymes, which are catalysts, and what you don't see is the maze of dotted lines that connect all these things. We have no clue how that works. None, zero, zip, not even a conceptual basis for understanding what makes that system stable and gives life the characteristic that it has. And in fact, I will argue with you that the scientific question, maybe one of two, for this century is the following. We know that that, or you, as a miraculous living creature, are made up of organs and cells, and the cells are made up of molecules which are reacting with one another. We know that molecules are not alive. We know that reactions are not alive, but collections of molecules and reactions which are not alive are alive. How does that happen? We do not know. The second question of this sort could well be, how does the brain think? And that, in some ways, is perhaps a more complicated question. But even this basically very simple question, we don't understand. So there are many questions in complexity that we don't understand, we may not be able to understand, but simplicity should be simpler. And it's not. So simplicity. It's not as simple as it seems. And I want to give you a couple of examples. First, some broad examples just to frame the problem. Then one specific example, which is the operation of the internet. And then some examples from our own research to illustrate the application of this kind of idea as a research strategy. Now, some framing issues. If you think about some kind of extreme, and you can form your own judgments, a rock is pretty simple and actually pretty dull, unless you want to bash in the head with it or something of that sort. And weather, just taking that as an example, local weather in particular, can be really hard to understand. So probably we need to bound the discussion by saying that there are things that are too dull, and simplicity is not like a rock, but it's down toward that end of things. And then there are things that are chaotic in the sense that they may not even be deterministically calculable. And those are probably too complex. So complexity is somewhere over here, and simplicity is somewhere over there. Now, what are a couple of examples of simple things? And here's an example of something that's really simple. And I want to walk through it because it's an example I like quite a lot. That is, you say, a cup. How tedious could you be? Why are we sitting here in this room talking about cups? The answer is, cup is more than it seems. For one thing, yes, it is a container for water. But it is arguably one of the most important inventions in public health the world has ever made. The reason for that, of course, is that if you want to sterilize water, the best way to do it, heat it. You can't put boiling water in your hand. You have to have something that looks like a cup. There it is. So the cup, because it was so simple to use, you just pour water into it. It's applicable to hot water, cold water. It becomes a tool for public health. Now, hot water, once you're accustomed to the idea in a cup, becomes a little boring. But if you have grass or leaves or things like that, you can drop that into the hot water, and you find you get flavors, the origin of coffee and tea. And also, by the way, the origin of self-medication and a whole series of things that come from that. So that's good. Now, the next question is, what do you do with something that's so simple that you can make flavored water out of it? The answer is that if you consider just the sociology of uses of cups, I would argue that, we hear everything in the world about how important cell phones are. Actually, most business is carried out over cups of coffee. So it becomes a vital determinant of the social structure of our economic world. And, very importantly, all of you can ask how your mother met your father. And so almost always a cup of coffee was involved at some critical point. So from that vantage, it's also a key element of human reproduction. And you can go through this. But at every point, The reason these things work is that it is so blindingly simple at each one of these stages that you can do things with it. Simple in function. Here are two other examples which have the same characteristic. The thing on the upper left-hand side there is a birth control pill. Very simple in function, but it's fundamentally changed the structure of some of the societies in the world by giving women a degree of control over their reproductive processes. It's changed society. Very simple to use. The underlying biology is very complicated. So you don't see the complexity. What you see is the simplicity. But as a result of that simplicity, you can do all kinds of things with it. Many of them quite unexpected. But here, simplicity leads to complexity, leads to change. And that change, we hope, in this society equalizes men and women as contributors, fundamentally changes the society, but then you start from that society, one that's gender blind in some sense, and move forward from there, and you've done something that's really complicated. This is, of course, the part of the internet, and let me tell you something about that as an exercise in this. I want to build up the internet for you, both technologically and intellectually, and I'm going to do this very quickly. So we start with the core of the internet, which is the simplest form of arithmetic. And it turns out that you can embed, as you know, any message, music, accounting, ledger, whatever you like, can all be embedded in binary arithmetic. Why do we use binary? The answer is it's the simplest thing that you can use, but also because it is simple, it has a characteristic that no other system has, which is that you can check for errors uniquely well with binary. And when Shannon put together his initial rules for binary, his job was not to make up a statistical mechanics of binary arithmetic, but rather to pump the maximum number of error-free bits down a pipe in the telephone system. I mean, he was doing a very utilitarian task. But out of that has come a mathematical structure which runs the world. So simplicity, and now that simplicity has led to something much more important than that. Okay, binary 1, 0, whatever. But you can't do a lot with that. So you think about how you make binary incarnate in some way. And the easiest way of thinking about it is in terms of switches, because switches can be on and off. Now, we all know about switches, and you have switches of this sort, light switch. Turn it on and off 5,000 times, and it ceases to work. So we need a light switch, the equivalent of a light switch, which has the characteristic that you turn it off on and off more times than that. It doesn't not work, and that's called a transistor. So you can turn a transistor on billions, trillions of times, and it works just fine. It also costs a lot less than a light switch does. So here's the simplest embodiment of this. Now, because transistors are so simple, add one other trick called photolithography, and you can build integrated circuits. A transistor by itself is nothing. Integrated circuit in which you make billions of transistors at a time is everything right now. So your cell phones will soon have chips in them that have 1 billion transistors, all of which operate correctly. It's truly, truly phenomenal. That's probably, that and the internet that follows is probably the greatest human construction in terms of engineering that's ever happened. It's phenomenal stuff. Now, based on integrated circuits, you can build cell phones. Cell phones have the characteristic that, of course, we can talk to one another, but even more than that, cell phones and telecommunications and the internet are the basis for globalization. So now you cannot be anywhere in the world without knowing more or less what everyone else is doing. Fundamental change based on binary, the simplest thing that you can imagine. And then you see maps like this. This is an older map, but it's a flow of bits, bit flow map. And here's, at this time, the US, and here is Europe, and I can't see it very well, but somewhere down here would be Asia. It would be quite different at this stage. At this stage, incidentally, a big fraction of the bits were used in transferring pornography. This tells you something about the nature of the human species. This has all changed. Now it's Goldman Sachs driven, so it's exchanging money. And that has led then to Google, and the modest summary of the Google plan, as you know, is to make all of the world's information, all the world's information available. A modest, modest thing, and they're doing actually a very good job of it. And based on that, we have Facebook. And what is Facebook doing? And Facebook is rewiring your children so that they become a different species altogether. And you think about this, it's truly amazing. And how could this have happened? And the answer is there are these layers of technology. And each layer, if you look inside it, it is staggeringly complicated. But it has been made to work so well that it becomes transparent and invisible to the users of the next layer. That's simplicity. Functional simplicity is such that all you need to worry about is what it does, and you don't need to worry at all about why it does it, because that's all been taken care of for you. And I argue that it's much, much, much more difficult to do that than to come up with something that's big and fancy. The amount of money that's gone into just the development of chips, you know, the R&D cost, is in excess of $1 trillion now globally. And I note that $1 trillion makes Slack look like child's play. So these are really big, big investments to make these things work well. So one of the things that we have come up with as a notion out of this discussion has been the idea of what we call in the group stacking. And what I mean by stacking is that a technology is cooked. You've succeeded when you go from an idea to a set of applications which have the characteristic that the users of the applications don't need to know anything about the ideas that made it up. And you can build layers of things that way. It's a very powerful idea. All right, so what are simple things then? Reliable, predictable in function and performance. They're cheap. And in many universities, when I utter the word cheap, I expect a lightning bolt to come and strike me, because this is considered a really bad word. But cheap is actually a very interesting concept, because when you talk about the cost of something, you are solving a problem that we don't have another way of solving. That is, I have a system, a device, or whatever it is, that combines raw materials, expertise, designs, accumulated knowledge, patents, cost of manufacture, you know, on and on, distribution systems. How do you put all of that together in such a fashion that you can measure the overall value of what you have? And the only way we have to do it is translate everything into cost and add it up together. So the issue of cost becomes the ultimate integrator of these ideas. Building blocks and stackable. And we've talked about both of these things. Now, I want to move to the last part of this talk, which is to illustrate this idea personally in something that's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of what you talk about when you talk about the internet. And that is, I'm going to take you over a trip that took about 30 years from the development of what are called SAM, self-assembled monolayers, to the thing we're working on now most, which is paper diagnostics and soft robotics, and show how all of that fits together. So what I'd like to do in each is to show you what the problem is that we were doing, because each of these is problem-driven, not curiosity-driven. And at the beginning, what we were interested in is the problem of simplifying surface science. I was more a simple scientist at that point. And the issue with surface science at that point was that it involved harnessing graduate students to a machine shop where they would spend 3 years building a large stainless steel box with various probes stuck into it. And then they would spend a year pumping this down and finding the leaks to put the interior under ultra-high vacuum. They would shine a beam of light off a surface and get some spots, and they would tell something about the surface structure, which is terrific. It took too long. So we were interested in how you simplified that process and how you moved it to organics. And here's what we did. This is what we did, and then how we did it comes next. This is just a wafer 5 inches across, thin film of gold evaporated on silicon. The left-hand side of this, we have dipped into an organic molecule that adsorbs on the surface in a particular way and presents methyl groups, so it becomes very hydrophobic. The right-hand side presents hydroxyl groups, so it's hydrophilic. And so you put a drop of water here, it spreads. A drop of water here, it beads. And what you have is one of the very early examples of what we now call materials by design. So you make a molecule, the molecule does something very easily, and that something has a material property which is macroscopic. That was an important idea. And so here are the kind of structures that we're concerned with. These are molecules. They're about 2 nanometers long. You design them correctly, and they line up in the surface, adsorb in the surface, basically form a 2-dimensional crystal. It's about the same size as a protein molecule is in diameter or in radius. So we're making things that are about that size. The difference here is that we're making these on scale of centimeters, which means that we're manipulating 10 to the 16th to 10 to the 18th molecules, as opposed to a protein, which is very much more complicated locally, but a very simple structure, a very much smaller structure. There are other reasons for being interested in that, but not relevant here. So this kind of surface science does not involve 2 years making a stainless steel thing. It basically just involves dipping one of these wafers into a solution, waiting 2 minutes, and you're done. So as simple as it can be done. High school students do it all the time. Now, the next problem was this one. And the problem was, how do you do nanometer scale fabrication? And why do you want to do nanometer scale fabrication? And the reason is the internet. You need to make the transistors smaller and smaller. And when we were doing this in the early 90s, it was believed at that point that 100 nanometers would be about the smallest you could ever make the critical parts of a transistor. Now, beyond my belief, the belief is the smallest size you can make them is about 10 nanometers, which is about 20 atoms across. But the problem, even then, was this. And it's very clear now that the fabrication lines, the so-called fabs, that make the next generation of chips will cost somewhere between $5 and $10 billion a fab. And even for the electronics companies, that's a lot of money, particularly if they are only good for about 3 years, and then they're replaced with another generation beyond that. So there was a great push to make things cheaper. Well, in fact, the engineers at Intel have solved this problem in a way that no one can possibly compete with. Intel, Taiwan Semiconductor, other places. That's a different story. Fantastic engineering. But we were interested in trying to find another way. And so what we did was to take this idea, which had become so simple, as they say, that anyone could do it, and we simply made a stamp. And we would take a surface of gold, and we would stamp the surface with a little rubber stamp that was inked with the molecules that made the self-assembled monolayer. And then you took the nanometer-thick film of self-assembled monolayer and used that to protect the surface from corrosion, and it became a form of resist. So again, a very simple idea. And literally, when we started this, we would go down to Harvard Square and buy various stamps of this sort. What we used as masters to make this was simply structures printed out on a high-resolution inkjet printer. And the chemistry is not important, but what came out of it at that point was the ability to make structures of that kind. And these are, in fact, now entering real use some years later. But the immediate thing that you could do with them, and this has been a success in research, is that you take a messy object like this, which is a mammalian cell growing on a petri dish, and you print on the petri dish a pattern in which, let's say, this square absorbs protein from the medium, and the region out here does not. You do that chemistry correctly using these printing techniques, and you can make the cells do things that they really, really don't want to do, like growing, being squares. And then you find things that you hadn't really expected, as, for example, when it forms a square, it only attaches to the surface around the outside. Here's the nucleus, here's some structural fibers inside. But this poor cell is doing something that it really isn't interested in doing at all. And that's turned out to be a pretty useful, but not very important kind of science. But you can go from there to another stage, which is to look at another problem, which is how do you study the movement of fluids in really small spaces? And why do you want to? The answer is very small analytical devices, understanding blood flow in capillaries and sap flow in trees, doing things of this kind. And this has been the basis of an area called microfluidics. And in microfluidics, because it is so simple to make these stamps, all you have to do is to make the stamp of the right sort, put it down, and now effectively glue it in place. And these declivities here now become channels through which you can flow fluid. And here you see an example of such a thing. This is a serpentine pattern, which comes down here. And you see immediately something which is actually quite interesting, and that is that if you put blue in here and you put red in here, they go all through this stuff, but they don't completely mix. And that's a phenomenon called low Reynolds number flow. It's very well known to people who made pipelines, but it's the basis for a lot of application of known physics to interesting problems in microstructures. Now, this complicated system that you see here, something put together by Steve Quake, you say that's an electronic circuit, isn't it? And the answer is no, that's all fluids moving in very small structures. And the current versions of these will have the ability to generate drops that are a few microns in size and distribute 300,000 or 400,000 of them into little wells and then do things with them. Sort of interesting. It turns out it's too complicated. So this chemistry is being used, but not being used widely. We have always tried to stick with the simple stuff, and here's an example of a simple system of this sort. Here are inlets, here's some mixers and things of this kind. Here's a power source, which is basically just sucking on this with a syringe, and that's intended to make an analytical device that's a low-cost analytical device. And you say, that's pretty simple, pretty cheap, and the answer is still too expensive to use for most purposes. And I'll show you how to solve that problem in the next section, which deals with diagnostics for developing economies and also for point of care and public health. And this is embodied in some work that we do in an area called paper diagnostics. And our interest in this area is the interest that looks up here. It looks at healthcare in the developing world. Why focus on diagnostics? Partially because we know how to do diagnostics, and partially because although diagnostic systems in most healthcare systems only are, in the US it's about 15% of the total cost. It determines the cost of about 60%. And I can see a sort of look that suggests get done. Okay, I'm getting done. I just want to show you one or two videos. I apologize. So anyway, the point is that this technology and this technology, point of care, are very much the same. Now, there's an interesting point here for you to pay attention to. This is a wonderful graph, which is lifespan from Japan to the US. And here is the lifespan. Here is the amount of money that we spend. Here is the lifespan. Turns out everybody lives to be about 78 plus or minus 2 years, even though, for example, the US spends about $7,500 per person per year, and Cuba spends about zero. And there are several ways of thinking about that. One, which I suggest as one of these slow-moving things, is that, in fact, healthcare may not make any difference as it's done high end. Public health does, but low end may not. You think that's nonsense. If you haven't read this book, you must. It's a recent report by the Institutes of Medicine, which takes the US healthcare system and grades it according to 20 metrics and asks how well we do. And out of 20 developed nations, we are either last or second to last in every category. So the US healthcare system sucks. And this is something that the public doesn't recognize. You all could help. All right, just very quickly, I apologize for running over, but this is where we started in this. This is making systems using basically comic book technology that distributes serum into, this is dye, into a piece of paper. This is where we are only 5 years later in field trials, and the technology works this way. A drop of blood goes onto one of these little chips, is distributed, and then you read out the colors. That's all there is. That's simple enough. You can actually do something with that. Now let me just touch on the one that, may I do this because, you want me to stop? Okay. I'll skip the whole area of soft robotics and go to the very end. You have to make a choice. You're the leader. I'll do it quickly. I'll show you just a couple of videos. All right. The problem here is jobs. And the issue of jobs is usually phrased in terms of the competition between the US and China, expensive, inexpensive. That's not it. It's really between people and machines. That's going to be the big thing for the future. And so what is it in a globalized world that nations really compete for? And I'll up your, it's not gold, it's not land, it's not anything else. What we're doing now is we're competing for jobs. And you say this is a small thing. If you are a nation that takes a long-term view of conflict, and you would like to get rid of this pesky thing called the United States, how would you do it? And the answer is you take away the jobs from the children so they can't enter the workforce, which is some of what's happening right now. The reason why it's important for you to explain this business of technology. I want to show you just a couple of videos because I'm trying to be Tony for those of you who are young. We now switch to videos. This program started from Coca-Cola cans. An applied problem, which was, how do you make something that looks like a Coca-Cola can that will have the characteristic that on demand it unrolls into something that walks autonomously across the floor, finds a door, goes under it, comes up the other side, and refolds into a Coca-Cola can. Very practical problem. If you happen to be in special operations. But the issue there is that, let me show you what the competition is for this. This is one of my favorite objects. What I want you to do is look at the next part of this. The next part of it is how beautifully this thing picks up this, shifts its weight and balances as it heaves it over its head. Looks to me just like an animal. So we can now make, or more properly Boston Dynamics can now make machines that behave as well as animals and, you know, add computers and you've got something that's really interesting here. Is there a competition? And the competition that we're interested in is this. And I'll just give you a little bit of it. I'll save for another story some of what it can't do. No machine can do that, nor, by the way, can we do that. The squid has, among its other interesting characteristics, the fact that its brain is plastic, so it can squeeze the entire thing, including the brain, out. So, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll skip it. So how we do this is we take systems that have the characteristic that they have little inflatable bladders on one side. When you take a stiff layer here, an inflatable layer here, you blow this up, you get something that looks like that. And 2 videos to show you how that works. Here is a gripper. There it is. There's one input to it here. This comes down, picks up, in this case, a raw egg, and does so with no controls, no problems, because there's no pressure that's excess. It can also pick up little mice and, in principle, with development, babies. And here is something which it can do that other things can't do. Same gripper. And imagine doing this with a machine. That's a mallet, in case you don't recognize it. And imagine that as your hand. And, you know, it does what it does. And to show you this is real, it does that. So they're essentially unbreakable. They can be made quite rapid. Now, it's a fair distance from there to Shostakovich, but the fact is that if you think about going from a transistor to the internet, it's not as far as you might think. That's fast. I'll skip that. That just shows purely ambulatory. This is the last of these, and the reason for showing this is that it shows the first applications of this if I can get my cursor to work. Here we are. And these are the same things that we're playing the piano. They're stitched to a glove. And why is that interesting? And the answer is this turns out to be what we loosely call a product, which is going to be used for rehabilitation and for aiding people who have, for example, stroke and things of that kind. So it's been 3 years to go from this Coke can problem to this as a spun out pre-commercial technology because it's so simple. All right, that's the end. So what is the final conclusions in this that I'd like you to think about? There is a way of going from simplicity to reality in a short period of time so that we're going to have jobs for our grandchildren. And that is by focusing on simplicity and by focusing on end results. And I will argue that for most people, particularly in universities, having an objective does not corrupt the spirit of fundamental inquiry, even though I'm told repeatedly the opposite, that a product is a good idea, and what is a product? It's a solution, specific solution to a specific problem that is so valuable that people will do this most human and intimate of interactions, which is to write you a check in order to use it. And converting an idea into reality is actually more difficult and expensive than it is to come up with the idea in the first place. And finally, that I think we have an ethical responsibility to pay the bills to society if it pays for us. I'm sorry to have gone on too long. Done.
George, thanks so much for a masterful talk on a big subject and making it simple. So we want to present you with the first Patrusky Prism in honor of giving the first Patrusky Lecture and also being the first father and son team to make an appearance at New Horizons in 51 years. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Can you actually hold it with one hand? Thank you. Come up. You need to have a picture.
Thank you. Have a good one.